it is really difficult to ask someone, okay, so at 10:30 yesterday, how were you feeling? So instead, it's much better to try and capture those emotions within context. So I do that using video. So I've been using some GoPro cameras to help students as well as clinicians to first eye video their interactions, and then in one research project we had students look back on those videos as a source of additional, 2 different projects we've done that as a source of reflection. And then also for the clinicians, you know, if I'm collecting hours and hours of data, they're not going to be able to watch all of that. So instead, this is part of a methodology called video reflexive ethnography, where the kind of what I consider to be key clips are edited and transcribed, and then in a focus group presented back to those clinicians for their reflections. So these kinds of sources of data then are layered. It's not just about what people say, it's about looking at what they're doing and then what they're saying about what they're doing. So it's quite a wide range of different sources, but especially in the sociology of emotions, that's really important to kind of capturing a complete picture, but also to health sociology, because there are so many players involved within the medical scene, or healthcare scene, from not the traditional focus of nurses, doctors, patients, but also carers, administrative staff, and also even the cleaners, that all set a specific you might say emotional climate within a particular department or ward that will have an impact on how people work, how people feel, how people are. So it needs to be, I think, layered from often those transcribed responsive sources of data through interviews, focus groups, and surveys are then translated into text. But it's important that that is supplemented with field notes about what's happening in the broader scene. How did the department smell? What was the kind of tone like? And that could be, emotionally, or that could even be about the music that's playing. So it's important that sensory data from the researcher is used to supplement that textual data, and that you are kind of paying attention in your observational work and in your reflections back on video sources, that you are highlighting where you can a range of different sensory information.
At the moment, we're being connected in a very literal way through like the Human Genome Project, and I think it's really, I think we're feeling connected to human culture, and that's being affirmed and reaffirmed through genetics and epigenetics, and the idea that our body is, if we can use the word literal text, scientists are spitting out reams and reams of this text through the genetic code, which is telling us that we are absolutely connected, and we are also absolutely different as well. And I think that's translating directly to 4 little letters that we use to denote our DNA. And I think that's a really, really incredible dimension to understanding the body as text, whereby this is now I guess the data that we're using at the moment to understand our bodies and understand our evolutionary history. If you can draw it in, I think it's an important part of historical style, when you're writing in a way that engages your reader. I think the human action has got to be at the center of it, but also the human dilemma, the questions, the challenges that people faced, the assumptions they had, the values they brought to whatever the subject of your history writing is. But I think a good narrative historian, a historian who actually understands how to unpack and develop a good story through their work, will always be alert to that kind of atmosphere.
I think Simon Sharma, who's a very fine analytical historian who also happens to be a TV celebrity, he can do both. He can tell a great story, but he can also develop very sophisticated arguments and points of analysis. And he says it's always pays to know what the weather was on the day that you're writing about. Did the day dawn bright and sunny, or was there an early morning shower? So a good example of that is the opening of the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. The great kind of climactic moment of kind of the mythology of industry and progress in Britain in the 19th century, put on display in Hyde Park. And it rained that morning, and so as the Queen was on her way in the royal procession towards Hyde Park in order to open the Great Exhibition, which was housed in the Crystal Palace, a gigantic building of glass, the fact that it had rained and then the sun came out meant that the sunshine shone on this kind of wet surface of the glass. And so the Queen wrote about that in her diary, and that's kind of really striking, this visual image of this magnificent, gigantic pavilion of shining glass because of the rain.
I think it's a matter of fully respecting the objects of your study, and actually fully trying to immerse yourself in the way they functioned when they were used, and also the way they functioned now. So understanding, it would be similar to a text in some ways, in that you're kind of thinking about why it was written, who it was written for, and the things that went into it as it was written, but also the ways that it's been read over time, and the way that it can be read when you're reading it, and the kind of the things you're getting out of it. I see that, for me, I see that as a kind of as a matter of respect. You shouldn't just try to take bits from the things you're studying and fit them into your argument. You should fully you should be prepared to completely change your view according to what this object, this thing is saying to you and what it's doing to you.
One of the big things that I noticed when I first started looking at physical objects, whether it be paintings, for instance, or whether it be sculptures, looking at artworks, that the difference with looking at print text is that the print text is going to look the same wherever you are. So, if I'm reading a book, the book is going to be the same whether I have a reprint copy. Some very old books, there might be something different about looking at the original book, but otherwise the print material is going to be, the content is going to be the same wherever you are. But I have been constantly surprised, most recently, just a few weeks ago, when I go to look at physical objects, that they look so different than they do in reproductions of books. So at the moment, I'm doing a lot of work on early automata, mechanical objects from the 18th and 19th centuries. And there was a very famous piece that I was going to look at, which is it's an Indian piece of a tiger eating an Englishman. It's a political piece. Indians, surprise, surprise, weren't that happy about the colonization history of the Britons in India. So it was made in the late 18th century, early 19th century. But I'd seen YouTube clips of this piece. I thought I'd done my homework before I went to see the real thing. But the way that things look on film can be different than they look in real life. When I turned up to see this piece, it was enormous. I was so surprised by and the size tells you something about the manufacture of the piece, for one thing, but also its cultural and political significance. So I really thought that it was about this big, but the man who was being mauled by the tiger was a full-size figure. Those kinds of things, or if you're looking at artworks, if you're looking at a reproduction of an artwork in a book, you can't be sure that the colour you're seeing is accurate or not. There are so many differences when you're looking at physical objects. The need to actually see them in real life, to see the actual object, and the amount that you get out of seeing that, it's completely incomparable to text analysis.
So much of many objects is all about touch, and we're sort of completely limited in the way that we can touch artworks, and rightly so. So that whole this sort of sensory aspects of objects are quite important to understanding how they function and getting all the senses involved, even smell and things like that. So yeah, it certainly adds more dimensions. And when you're looking at religious imagery, they don't exist on a wall in a white cube. It's absolutely this onslaught of objects, talking about relics and monstrances and altarpieces, and it's this, and the smell of incense. I mean, it's very much a part of contextualising a two-dimensional image. It's all around you.
As an historical archaeologist, I do work with text because I work with government archival sources. I work with diaries, photographs. So I'm working with a lot of documents, but I'm also then working with the artefacts that we excavate. Mostly that's ceramics and glass, but it could be other things like wood and metal and bone. And, so that sort of non-textual material is, I guess, what distinctly makes archaeology. It's how archaeology differs from history and other disciplines that are addressing similar questions, is that because we're using that body of evidence. But I don't read individual objects. That what I do is I look at the context of individual objects within the archaeological record and within the historical record, what I call the historical record, the textual record. So I'm recording individual attributes of objects, but I'm looking at those objects in their context within the suite of other objects, their context within the stratigraphic profile of the archaeological record, and I'm looking at them in a historical sense and in how they fit with the documents. There is a whole theoretical movement within archaeology called contextual archaeology, which is about reading objects. There is no way that I accept that objects talk to us. Some anthropologists would argue that objects talk to us, but I don't accept that. But what I do is I read the context within which the objects occur. Many people think that historical archaeology is a simpler form of archaeology because we do have things like texts and photographs to help us in our interpretation of the archaeological record. I actually think it complicates and makes it much harder because we have to deal with all these questions around textuality and interpretation.
One of the things we're really interested in going forward after this project, and I'm writing about at the moment with regards to young adult fiction, is that convergent culture that is happening where the expectation is no longer that we will just read a book and be done with it, that this world will persist beyond the book. And certainly popular fiction is just smashing this stuff. I mean, you think about Harry Potter, okay, I'll just give you a couple of examples, right? We all know it was made into a movie. We all know that we can buy merchandise, we can buy our Nimbus 2000 broom and so on. We all know that we can go to Pottermore. We all know what house we're in. I'm in Slytherin, which was just a terrifying thing to find out about myself. But did you know last year that a group of British scientists named a newly discovered wasp the Dementor wasp? Because it functions how, I haven't read Harry Potter, it does something like Dementors do. And I just think that's not even an adjacent industry. That's a long way from publishing, and it's a long way from magic schools when science is starting to borrow the lexicon of popular fiction. So this is probably my biggest interest in popular fiction. Even though I write it and I love it and I love being individualistic and in the text, what really excites me about it is the way that it travels.